Hello and welcome to Stories of Science. Here, we look back on humanity's long journey to understand the world. The questions, the failures, and the breakthroughs that slowly changed how we see the universe and ourselves. We tell science as stories. Apollo 13, A Miracle in Space. We're often drawn to success stories, people like Bill Gates, Elon Musk, those figures whose books, speeches, and remarkable achievements always leave us feeling inspired. But behind that success, there's usually a hidden story of setbacks and failures. Many people focus only on their shining moments, overlooking the stumbles along the way. More importantly, it's those failures and mistakes that hold the most valuable lessons. Today, we're going to talk about a classic case of a failure turning into a turning point, the Apollo 13 mission. It was supposed to be a monumental human adventure into space, but a sudden disaster turned it into a life-and-death struggle. This wasn't just a failed mission, it's a real-life story of how humans found hope in the face of disaster, pushed beyond their limits, and made an incredible comeback. As always, let's start by introducing the three heroes of today's story. First, Jim Lovell. Jim Lovell was born in 1936 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From a young age, he was captivated by aviation and flight. He loved watching air shows, especially the aerobatics performed by the pilots. Lovell's father was a worker, and his family wasn't particularly well off, but his parents always encouraged him to pursue his dreams. His mother, in particular, was very supportive of his passion for aviation. As a child, Lovell was fascinated by model airplanes, and as a teenager, he even built his own simple flying machine. While its performance left much to be desired, it only solidified his resolve to become a pilot. As the commander of Apollo 13, Jim Lovell was the leader of the mission. He had originally planned to lead the astronauts to the moon, but after the oxygen tank explosion mid-mission, the mission quickly turned into a life-or-death survival challenge. Lovell's calm under pressure, decision-making ability, and leadership turned him into one of the greatest heroes in American space history. The failure of Apollo 13 didn't stop Lovell. After the mission, he continued to work at NASA, and in 1973, he participated in the Apollo-Soyuz test project, the first joint U.S. Soviet space mission. During this time, he held senior positions at NASA, overseeing the management and planning of several space projects. In 1981, Lovell retired and became an advisor to commercial space companies. He also became a public speaker, sharing his space experiences and inspiring countless people. Lovell was also an author, and his autobiography Lost Moon vividly describes the Apollo 13 experience, which was later adapted into the famous film Apollo 13. Next, we have Fred Haise. Fred Haise was born in 1933 in Biloxi, Mississippi. From an early age, he was fascinated by flight, particularly watching pilots fly and perform aerobatic maneuvers. His father, a former Air Force officer, had a profound influence on Haise's passion for space exploration. Haise had a natural talent for problem-solving and mechanics. As a child, he once took apart an old airplane model his father owned, only to completely dismantle it. His father was furious, but Haise learned key principles about understanding and fixing aircraft. Fred Haise was the lunar module pilot on Apollo 13. Although he didn't get the chance to land on the moon, he played a critical role in the mission. After the oxygen tank explosion, Haise worked alongside Lovell and Swigert to solve numerous technical problems and ensure the spacecraft's safety. During the crisis, Haise showed remarkable emergency response skills and calm judgment. After the Apollo 13 mission, Haise continued his work with NASA but did not participate in subsequent manned lunar missions. In 1973, he transitioned into the commercial space industry, working as an advisor to aviation and aerospace companies. In 1981, Haise shifted to education, becoming a university professor, passing on his space experience and technical knowledge to a new generation of engineers and pilots. He also actively participated in space history lectures and science outreach, becoming a seasoned expert in the field. Finally, let's talk about Jack Swigert. Jack Swigert was born in 1931 in Denver, Colorado. From a young age, Swigert showed a strong interest in aviation. Although he worked as a mechanic during his teenage years, his real passion was always space technology and flight. In high school, he joined the aviation club and earned his private pilot's license. Interestingly, Swigert showed an incredible independent spirit even as a teenager. After graduating from high school, he chose to join the U.S. Air Force, where he quickly stood out as a pilot. Swigert wasn't originally supposed to be on Apollo 13. He was brought in just 2 days before the mission, replacing the original pilot who had been removed due to health issues. Even though he didn't have much time to prepare, Swigert quickly integrated into the team and performed brilliantly during the mission. On Apollo 13, Swigert faced the sudden oxygen tank explosion with the rest of the crew. As the command module pilot, he remained calm and ensured the spacecraft's flight and safe return. Despite being the backup pilot, his calmness and decision-making in a critical moment made him a part of space history. After the mission, Swigert continued working at NASA but didn't continue in the space program for much longer. In 1973, he retired from NASA and moved into politics. In 1974, he was elected to the U.S. Congress as a representative from Colorado, where he served and contributed to policies related to space and technology. Later in life, Swigert became an advocate for science education and public speaking. Though he left the space field, his contributions in politics and public service earned him widespread recognition. Now that we've gotten to know our 3 heroes, let's take a look at the mission plan for Apollo 13. The target landing site for Apollo 13 was the Miracle Highlands on the Moon, located in the northeastern part of the lunar surface. This area was chosen because scientists believed it contained preserved geological features from the Moon's early history, key to understanding the Moon's origin. The mission's goals were clear: land on the Moon's surface, conduct scientific experiments, collect samples, and install experimental equipment to explore the mysteries of our nearest neighbor. Fred Haise and Jim Lovell were the ones assigned to operate the lunar module, while Jack Swigert was in charge of the command module. The lunar module was set to separate from the command module, descend to the Moon's surface, and, during this process, Lovell and Haise would manually control a slow, precise landing. The plan included a 2-hour moonwalk for the astronauts. They were to deploy a set of scientific instruments on the Moon's surface, which would be left there for long-term experiments, including measuring lunar temperature, magnetic fields, and seismic activity. Of course, the astronauts would also collect lunar samples to be brought back to Earth for further analysis. April 11, 1970, saw Apollo 13 successfully launch from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, carrying our 3 astronauts. At first, everything seemed to go as planned. The rocket fired up, the powerful thrust sent the spacecraft into space, and the astronauts were quickly on their way to Earth orbit. The mission on that day was clear-cut: fly to the Moon, land, collect samples, conduct experiments, and begin to uncover the mysteries of the lunar surface. The astronauts were tasked with gathering lunar geology samples and using scientific experiments to help answer some of the biggest questions about the Moon and the universe. As Jim Lovell later recalled, at that moment, it felt like we were living out a science fiction novel. We were heading for the Moon, and everything just felt like it was supposed to happen. It seemed so natural. There were no signs that this mission would take a turn for the worse. The Apollo 13 crew, like all astronauts, had undergone years of rigorous training and were fully prepared. They had checked and rechecked the spacecraft's systems, made adjustments, and ensured everything was in order. As they said, we were following the steps, and everything was going smoothly. Then, on the 3rd day of the mission, April 13, 1970, with the crew about 55 hours into the flight and still some distance from the Moon's landing site, things took a catastrophic turn. What seemed like just another ordinary day soon became the darkest day of their lives. "We were just doing routine checks," said Jack Swigert, the command module pilot. "I was conducting a routine systems check and thinking that after this, I'd finally get a break. Then, just a few seconds later, I heard this deafening explosion. Boom! The sound was so intense that it rocked the entire spacecraft. For Swigert, that moment was far more real and terrifying than any movie explosion could ever be. At that moment, it felt like my heart nearly stopped," Jim Lovell, the Apollo 13 commander, said, his voice quiet. "This wasn't a movie explosion. It was a cold, deep feeling that came from within. That boom pulled us out of our calm, peaceful state and into an entirely different world." The explosion came when the oxygen tank in the service module ruptured, releasing a metallic, burning smell into the air. The shockwave shook the spacecraft, as if the entire universe trembled at that moment. Then came the rapid loss of oxygen, the electrical systems failed almost instantly, and the spacecraft's life support systems were in total disarray. What was once a warm, comfortable command module was now an out-of-control drifting ship, floating in the emptiness of space, without direction or hope. The explosion of the oxygen tank instantly destroyed our spacecraft, Jim Lovell said, his voice heavy. Our life support system collapsed in seconds, the oxygen supply was cut off, and the power was nearly completely lost. The temperature started plummeting, and everything felt so foreign. We suddenly felt like we had fallen into a huge black hole, unable to control anything. At that moment, the astronauts' first reaction wasn't panic, it was to try to quickly figure out what had happened. The instruments inside the spacecraft showed rapidly decreasing pressure, and a comm level quickly began adjusting the spacecraft's control panels while checking the systems. But every indicator he saw told him that things were deteriorating fast. We couldn't even fully comprehend the seriousness of the situation at that moment, Lovell remembered. I kept my eyes on the indicators, watching the numbers drop. I knew it was bad. Oxygen was leaking, the power was unstable, and the instruments were showing worse and worse readings. In that moment, countless thoughts raced through the astronauts' minds, but they chose to push aside the fear and anxiety that came with things they couldn't control. Lovell, staying calm, continued to operate the controls, but even he couldn't escape the terrifying thought that crossed his mind. "We're done for," Lovell said, admitting the fear he felt. We couldn't move forward, and there was no way to go back. We had no choice but to rely on ourselves, our calmness, our training, and the skills we had learned, Lovell said. This was an unexpected disaster, Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, recalled, still stunned by the memory. We never thought something like this could happen. All we'd been focused on was landing on the moon. But now, our only goal became survival. As the crew scrambled to find a solution, Hayes noticed the rapid depletion of oxygen in the air, realizing just how much worse things were than they had originally thought. The spacecraft was in free fall, with even the core systems failing to provide enough power and data to maintain operations. We watched as system after system failed, Hayes continued. The spacecraft became silent, and that silence it made everything even worse. There was no sound, no warmth, just quiet. Jack Swigert did his best to stay calm, trying to reconnect some backup power systems in hopes of restoring some basic functions. But his efforts were met with no response. The spacecraft was on the brink of losing control. Oxygen was running out, power was failing, and the temperature kept dropping. It was like we were trapped in a nightmare, Swigert added. In that moment, we knew it could be a one-way trip. Despite their best efforts to stay composed, Lovell and his crew couldn't ignore the one burning question: if they couldn't fix this, how could they possibly make it back to Earth safely? And with communication to ground control growing more difficult by the minute, time seemed to be running out. We couldn't go forward, Hayes said after a pause. The mission was no longer about landing on the moon. It was about surviving. And that's when they realized everything had changed. They had to abandon the moon landing and focus solely on getting back to Earth. With the clock ticking, the astronauts had no choice but to work together and stay calm if they were going to make it out alive. Now, we had only one choice: change the orbit and shift the mission direction, Lovell said. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew that we had to stick together, keep calm, and do everything we could to survive. Meanwhile, ground control was already working frantically to analyze solutions and switch to a survival mode. But ultimately, everything hinged on the astronauts' ability to stay composed and react quickly. Ground control quickly activated their emergency protocol, calling in a massive team of engineers, commanders, technical experts, and emergency response teams. Everyone knew the mission had just taken a dramatic turn. Apollo 13's mission had gone from being a scientific exploration of the moon to a life-or-death struggle. To ensure the astronauts made it back alive, every decision now had to be based on two key factors: time and resources. Ground control launched an entirely new emergency plan to maximize the use of the spacecraft's remaining resources, extend the life support systems as long as possible, and calculate the best way to bring the astronauts safely back to Earth. Our goal was clear from the start: save the astronauts. We absolutely couldn't let them die for nothing, said one of the mission controllers. Every calculation, every decision, had to be based on making the most of the remaining resources. The first thing the team did was assess the remaining oxygen and power levels on Apollo 13, calculating how long they could last. In an emergency, the command module's power had to be minimized, and the spacecraft's temperature had to be kept within a safe range. Meanwhile, all non-essential equipment was powered down to make sure the critical systems could continue running with limited power. The consumption of power and oxygen became the heart of every decision. And, of course, ground control had to keep a constant eye on the astronauts' mental state as well. At the same time, ground control's computer engineers and space experts began urgently working on a new orbital plan. The original mission was to land on the Moon, but now, they had to adjust the spacecraft's trajectory so it could loop around the Moon, using the Moon's gravity to help slingshot the astronauts back to Earth. Every detail had to be calculated to perfection, because even a tiny error could prevent the spacecraft from successfully orbiting the Moon or making it back to Earth. At this point, we had to change the entire course of the mission, explained one of the engineers. Every calculation had to be precise, to the second, because even the slightest shift in the Moon's gravity could drastically affect the trajectory for their return. The communication between ground control and the astronauts was absolutely critical. To keep things as streamlined as possible in such an urgent situation, ground control decided to simplify all communications, focusing only on the most important instructions. At the same time, the team had to monitor the spacecraft's condition at all times, making sure that any changes could be addressed as quickly as possible. There was no time to worry about whether they would succeed. The mission was no longer about the science, it was about getting the astronauts home safely. Everyone in ground control knew that the only thing that mattered was survival. Stress, anxiety, pressure, every team member worked at an astonishing level of efficiency, making decisions and calculations that no one could have expected. We couldn't afford to let up for even a second, recalled one of the controllers. Every second mattered. We couldn't afford a single mistake. There was no time for panic, no time for hesitation. Everyone knew we had one goal: get the astronauts back alive, Jack Swigert said, reflecting on that time. You knew you couldn't falter because every second determined whether we'd make it home safely. The astronauts didn't have time to dwell on the complexity of the situation. Despite being in a near-desperate environment, they didn't stop thinking. In fact, they needed calm and rational thinking more than ever before. Every instruction, every move became crucial. One tiny mistake could lead to mission failure. This was a game of life or death, Hayes later said. There was no time to waste. Every decision was about life and death. Meanwhile, the close collaboration between ground control and the astronauts allowed them to maximize every resource available on the spacecraft. Despite the severe power shortages, they calculated and ensured the life support systems would last just long enough to get the astronauts back home. Ground control's engineers and experts worked tirelessly, adjusting the spacecraft's trajectory and communication systems. And perhaps most impressively, ground control showed an incredible spirit of teamwork when it mattered most. Each team member contributed their knowledge and experience, constantly offering solutions, ensuring that the astronauts held on to hope and the possibility of survival in the harshest conditions. The atmosphere in the control room was tense, said one of the mission commanders. Everyone knew this wasn't just a mission, it was a responsibility for lives. We kept calculating, kept adjusting. Every decision was tough, but we believed that as long as we didn't give up, the astronauts would make it home safely. As the mission pressed on, ground control didn't just have to coordinate complicated orbital adjustments. They also had to maintain close communication with the astronauts to ensure that every action they took reduced the risk as much as possible. After several hours of intense work, they finally created a plan to loop around the Moon, and the team began executing it. At this point, we knew we didn't have much time left, recalled one of the engineers. Every calculation, every adjustment, could mean the difference between the astronauts making it home safely or not. We gave it everything we had. After hours of tense calculations and coordination, Apollo 13 successfully flew around the Moon, used the Moon's gravity to adjust its orbit, and began the journey back to Earth. The success was thanks to ground control's calm response, seamless coordination, and the astronauts' determination and courage. "We got through this life-or-death test together," Hayes said. "Ground control gave us hope and strength." After days of a life-and-death struggle, Apollo 13 finally entered Earth's orbit. For the astronauts and every member of ground control, it was a huge relief. The original mission had completely changed. Moon landing was no longer possible, and now their only goal was getting safely back. On April 17, 1970, after precise lunar gravity manipulation, Apollo 13 successfully entered Earth's orbit. At this point, the spacecraft was about 30,000 kilometers from Earth's surface. While they still weren't completely out of danger, at least they had passed the most critical phase. But this didn't mean everything was safe yet. In fact, Apollo 13's real challenge was just beginning. Ground control knew that they still had huge technical hurdles to overcome, especially how to get the severely damaged spacecraft safely through the atmosphere and onto the ground. "We had to be precise in our landing," Jim Lovell recalled. "This was a situation we had never encountered before. The explosion had severely damaged the spacecraft, and control was limited." Back in December of 1969, Apollo 11 made history with the first successful moon landing. But for the Apollo 13 crew, their mission was a complete reversal of that success. They weren't landing on the Moon, they were about to enter Earth's atmosphere from tens of thousands of kilometers away, at nearly the speed of sound. To ensure the spacecraft could land safely, the heat shield on the command module had to be intact. The explosion and oxygen leak meant that the integrity of the heat shield was already compromised. To avoid overheating and causing severe damage, Lovell and the team had to rely on limited power and navigation systems, ensuring the spacecraft's angle as it re-entered the atmosphere was just right to control its flight path. The re-entry process of Apollo 13 was incredibly tense. On April 17, 1970, when the spacecraft entered Earth's atmosphere, it was traveling at nearly 39,000 kilometers per hour, about 35 times the speed of sound. The temperature outside the spacecraft was extreme, reaching about 1,650 degrees Celsius. Only the heat shield could protect the astronauts from these deadly temperatures. At that moment, every instrument on the spacecraft indicated that the chances of a successful landing were slim. With insufficient power and a malfunctioning navigation system, even if they managed to survive the atmospheric entry, they were likely to miss their landing site due to inadequate braking. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the Apollo 13 command module, relying on minimal control systems and precise calculations, successfully re-entered the atmosphere and began a steady descent. In the following minutes, every astronaut inside the command module was glued to their parachutes, hoping they would deploy. After several minutes of freefall, Apollo 13's parachutes deployed, slowing the spacecraft as it descended to the designated safety zone. Finally, at 1:08 p.m. on April 17, 1970, the command module successfully splash-landed in the Pacific Ocean, about 300 nautical miles from Hawaii. The landing point was about 300 nautical miles east of Honolulu in the Pacific Ocean, exactly as planned. Ground control had already set up full tracking and rescue operations. The USS Iwo Jima was stationed nearby, ready to recover the spacecraft as soon as it touched down. Once they landed, the astronauts were quickly surrounded by Navy rescue teams. Due to the extensive external damage to the spacecraft, the astronauts were thoroughly checked to ensure they weren't affected by radiation or the failure of the heat shield. Although Apollo 13 didn't make it to the Moon, the astronauts' performance and the calm response of ground control were hailed as a survival legend in space history. They didn't just turn a life-threatening crisis into a survival story, they also provided invaluable lessons for future space missions. When Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert appeared on the Navy ship, everyone watching around the world finally breathed a sigh of relief. Apollo 13 was meant to be a shining mission in the Apollo program, with a clear goal to land on the Moon, collect samples, and explore. It carried humanity's curiosity about the Moon and the universe, embodying the grand dream of scientific exploration. However, the mission entered the history books in an entirely different way. Its brilliance wasn't in landing on the moon, but in how the astronauts in ground control displayed extraordinary wisdom, courage, and teamwork when facing life-and-death challenges. On April 13, 1970, on the third day of the mission, an oxygen tank explosion nearly destroyed the spacecraft's life support systems, leaving the astronauts facing oxygen leaks, power loss, and communication breakdowns. Apollo 13 was no longer a mission of scientific discovery, it was a life-or-death struggle. The victory in this race against time wasn't achieved through mission objectives, but through humanity's deepest desire to survive and its incredible adaptability, evolving into one of the most magnificent survival stories in history. This mission wasn't just a test of technology, it was a challenge to the limits of human spirit. Faced with an unexpected crisis, Apollo 13's ground control displayed near-perfect emergency response capabilities. Once the severity of the situation became clear, the control center immediately activated emergency protocols, calculating how to ensure the astronauts' survival with limited resources. They didn't panic, nor did they speculate, they focused on solving each detail with logic and calm, ultimately designing a return route. "We've got a problem," Jim Lovell calmly reported, marking the beginning of the crisis. At that moment, ground control and the astronauts knew that the mission was no longer about landing on the moon, it was about survival. And the astronauts had no time to analyze complex technical issues. All they could rely on was ground control's cool-headed responses and their own understanding of the spacecraft. Lovell and his crew had to quickly shut down non-essential equipment, adjust the pressure, conserve oxygen, and use the moon's gravity to help adjust the spacecraft's orbit, using limited power to return to Earth. Every decision, every action, was a life-or-death choice. This wasn't just a technical challenge, it was a psychological battle. Remaining calm under pressure, making meticulous decisions without distraction, this self-control and teamwork ultimately turned Apollo 13 into a survival legend. Looking back at Apollo 13, it's no longer just a success or failure of a space mission, it's a model of human resilience and intelligence under extreme pressure. The victory in this life-or-death race became a history-making moment that taught us the true meaning of survival. Humans may not be invincible, but in the face of challenges, wisdom, courage, and unity can create unimaginable miracles. Apollo 13, though it didn't land on the moon, left an indelible mark on history. In the face of the most insurmountable obstacles, life itself is the most precious, and survival is the ultimate goal. And here's the most important lesson: no matter how tough the situation, as long as you don't give up, there's always hope. The people who change the world usually just think one step deeper. If this story made you see things differently, hit like, subscribe, and save it. See you in the next story.